Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today is the sixth video in my earliest large-scale conflicts between Native Americans and European colonial powers in North America series, and the 10th video in my early colonial debacles that disprove the inherent myth of European superiority series. The subject of today's video is what I like to call, and what a lot of academics like to call, America's first revolution. Now, before I reveal what that is, for those of you who haven't already read the title, I think it's important to note that when we hear, those of us, especially in America, when we hear the term the American Revolution, we think of 1776, George Washington, fighting against the British, etc., etc. However, not many people realize there was another large-scale revolution against a European colonial power over 100 years, well, more like and right at 100 years before the American Revolution, and that is the Great Pueblo Revolt against Spanish rule in New Mexico, which led to the revitalization of 17th century New Mexico. Okay, so right off the bat, whenever we hear the terms like New Mexico or the United States or China or what have you, whenever I bring up these geographic terms and countries and provinces, I like to point out how, for those of us who hear these things, we often think of the how they are now, like this map you see here of the American Southwest, which is a little bit variable because some people include Texas and Oklahoma into the American Southwest, but generally we think of something like this: New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, etc. However, this while this is not an incorrect image to have at all, it is also not a completely accurate image. After all, this map has only been this way for about 100 or so years. This region took on its geographic and political shape only after a long series of processes and events. So, as always, I like to pull back a little bit on the veil and go back a little bit in time to get a better look at the larger picture. Which leads us to the American Southwest before European colonization. So, prior to European colonization, the American Southwest was home to several complex cultures, uh, with three of the largest being the ancestral Puebloans, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam. So the Mogollon culture began, or at least was recognizable, first recognizable as a distinct culture in 200 CE, and lasted till there's debate on this, with some archaeological evidence suggesting their culture lasted until about 1450 CE, with others suggesting that they were still here in 1540 CE when the Spanish arrived. I would argue for the latter, but there's still some flexibility in that date. But the Mogollon were known for a variety of things: cliff dwellings and dwellings on the side of cliffs, as you can see here, with buildings made from adobe brick walls. They are also known for macaw pens, such as this one from Paquine in Chihuahua, Mexico. After all, if we go back up here you can see that the Mogollon culture extended from the southwestern of what part of what is now the United States and into the northwestern part of Mexico. They were also known for their membranous pottery, pottery, as you can see here. Then there was the Hohokam culture in Arizona. And again, much like the Mogollon, they were known for their complex cliff dwellings made from adobe brick walls. And it should be clear that both of these also had dwellings that were not on cliffs, but these are what they're generally known for is their cliff dwellings, such as this. And they began, or at least became, a recognizable, distinct culture around 300 CE and lasted until around 1500 CE. And they are known for things like Casas Grande, as well as Hohokam ball courts, which were definitely inspired excuse me, definitely inspired by Mesoamerican ball courts, as we know they had trade with Mesoamerica, which we'll get to a little bit later in the video. And here's just a general map of the Hohokam ball courts. They are also known for their irrigation systems, as you can see here. And here's a map of their irrigation systems, which were very complex, and as you can see, covered a large area. And then you had to the north of both of these, the ancestral Puebloans, who became a recognizable, distinct culture a little bit later than the Mogollon and the Hohokam, with the ancestral Puebloans being a recognizably distinct culture around 700 CE, and with their culture lasting until 1600 CE. Really longer than that, as the Puebloans are still here, but the ancestral Puebloans are who we're talking about right now, not their descendants. So their culture lasted until about 1600, and there's a big reason for that we'll talk about later on in the video. And they are known for, the ancestral Puebloans are known, of course, for their cliff dwellings like you see here, but also cities and pueblos from Chaco Canyon, such as Pueblo Bonito, which you see here, which is one of the larger, actually, I think it is the largest known kiva or building, Pueblo building that we know of. They're also known for the Great North Road, which would lead into Chaco Canyon from other residential areas, if we'll put it, other villages and things like that, and other regions, cultural regions as well, like possibly from, say, the Mogollon and such. And here's a map of the Great North Road here. So now that we've covered the each culture and the specific things that each culture is known for, now it is time to go into the things that were common for all three of these cultures. With the first being that all three of these cultures practiced agriculture. All three cultures, the Puebloans, the Hohokam, and the Mogollon, would grow a variety of crops, and it's important to note that this is variable by region for the most part, but generally you could see things grown by these cultures, such as agave, which is one of the things that it provides a lot of food sources, and is also one of the key ingredients in tequila. And then you have things like corn, of course. All three of these cultures grew beans and then squash. Cotton was grown to some degree, and then of course tobacco. I also want to come back over to the agave and note that while I said that the agave was a key ingredient in tequila, this is not an invitation to continue harmful stereotypes about Native Americans being drunks. Tequila was invented way, way later. Agave was grown because it is a very hardy desert plant and provides a good source of uh, water from the plant itself. These cultures also spent a certain amount of time hunting various different types of wildlife, such as both wild and domestic turkeys and deer. All three of these cultures also had access to a very complex trade route that spanned the entire continent of North America, as you can see here. Trade items included, but were not limited to, ceremonial pipes, as well as the pipestone, not very creatively named, but whatever, the pipestone that the pipes were made from, turquoise, marine shells from the Gulf and the Pacific coast that would be turned into things like this bracelet that you see here, and scarlet macaws over here on the right that would be brought as luxury items from Mesoamerica, as you can see on this map, up to places like Paquimé, and then Pueblo Grande, Snaketown, Pueblo Bonita, Chaco Canyon, etc. It was also towards the end of the towards the end of what we would argue is their cultural distinctiveness that the region also began to see the migration of new cultural groups, such as the ancestral Utes, and I apologize ahead of time to members of the Ute Nation if for probably butchering this, but more properly known as the Nuchiu, as well as the Navajo or the Dene, and the Apache, or more properly known as the Inde. And again, apologies to both the Navajo and the Apache for possibly butchering those. And these three groups began to migrate into the region of the American Southwest somewhere between 1300 to 1500 CE. And this was happening at the same time as when the ancestral Puebloans themselves were beginning to migrate further south. So it's important to note that this does not mean necessarily that these peoples were the ones who were pushing out these peoples. I mean, I'm sure there was some contact and maybe some intercultural fighting, but that does not mean that that is why the ancestral Puebloans began to migrate further south. And so here is the migration routes of the Utes and the Navajo, and then the migration routes of the Apache. With the Apache and the Navajo being members of the Athabascan language family, which has, of course, Athabascan speaking peoples now in the Southwest, but with Athabascan speaking peoples originally coming from areas like the Pacific Northwest, and especially from Canada and Alaska. All right, so with that, now it is time to move on to the next section. And the explanation as to why many of these cultures, all three of these cultures, begin to decline around the 15 and 1600s. And that is the Spanish colonization of the North American Southwest. So, The Spanish Empire first began to make its inroads into what is now the American Southwest with the Coronado expeditions led by Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, who led several expeditions, one expedition from 1540 to 1542 CE. And during his expeditions and his quote unquote exploration into the American Southwest, he actually participated in a small 1 year war with the cultures of the American Southwest, specifically the Puebloans and the Mogollon, in what is known as the Tigwix War, which resulted in heavy casualties for the Pueblos, and eventually resulted in several Pueblo individuals being essentially they were called enlisted, but forced to march with Coronado further into the North American interior, into what is now Nebraska, in search of specifically a mythical city. Well, I don't want to say mythical city, but in search of a city that the Puebloans probably came up with to try to get the Coronado and his group to leave them alone, but a city called Cuvira that supposedly had as much gold as, say, Tenochtitlan, or the say the say the Inca and such, like at their capital of Cusco. But as I said, that this was probably made up in an attempt to get the Spaniards to leave them alone. So eventually, when they made it to Kansas, and after traveling through Kansas for several weeks, I said Nebraska, but it's Kansas, as I'm reading the sign here to the right. But after they were traveling through Kansas for several weeks, it began to become increasingly apparent that Kuvira did not exist, and so the guide that told them about this, as you can read in the sign to the right, was strangled by Coronado and his group, and then eventually he returned into Spanish-held Mexico, and essentially having a very unsuccessful journey, which, if we come back to this map right here, is pretty par for the course, because Hernando de Soto was also facing very similar experiences in the American Southeast. But 50 years later, almost 60 years later, the Spanish would return to the American Southwest, led by Juan de Oñate, where he would begin to establish Spanish New Mexico. Juan de Oñate was appointed governor of this proposed colony of New Mexico by the Spanish viceroy, Luis de Velasco, as you can see here. And so, after receiving the appointment of governor, Oñate would gather 129 soldiers and 10 Franciscan priests, as well as a large number of women, children, servants, slaves, and livestock, and he would march into the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico in 1598 CE, where he would eventually found Santa Fe, as well as would eventually cause the Acoma massacre. So this was a massacre that Oñate ordered done against the Acoma, Pueblo town of Acoma, brutally subjugating and slaughtering many of the Pueblo inhabitants inside, and officially creating the colony of New Mexico. And so once the colony of the colony of New Mexico was created, the Spanish would begin building Spanish missions or churches, things like that, and would begin the conversion of the indigenous peoples of the North American Southwest. And with this, indigenous religious practices, religious figures, and ceremonial sites would be outlawed, such as kachina dances. You see here the use of kivas for ceremonial purposes. Here's a kiva right here, as well as the outlawing of medicine men, as they were dubbed in the eyes of the Catholic Church, sorcerers and devil worshippers. Of course, they weren't either of those, but when you're a colonial power subjugating a people, it's a useful tool is to vilify the religious practices of the culture you are conquering, colonizing. And here's a inside view of what a kiva would have looked like. Also, as New Mexico and really all of the Spanish colonies were being established in Mexico and Peru and the Caribbean and such, eventually came the establishment of the encomienda system in New Mexico, and as well as the enslavement of Native Americans. So, what is the encomienda system? So, the encomienda system is the system where, at least according to the plan, Spanish settlers would protect and care for and Christianize Native Americans, while Native Americans would work for a portion of their time for Spanish settlers at their what were essentially plantations. But of course, that wasn't the reality. The reality was Spanish settlers forced long labor, didn't pay the Native American workers, did not protect the Native American workers, seized Native American lands, and large amounts of Native Americans die from diseases and harsh living and working conditions. And it is important to note that, yes, the encomienda did end after several members of the clergy protested and after several Native American revolts. But the encomienda was essentially renamed the repartimiento system. Which was essentially just the same thing under the same name. There were some minor differences, but not enough to really justify explaining what the repartimiento system is, as it's essentially the encomienda system. And so this new system of forced slavery on Native Americans, the enslavement of Native Americans in the encomienda system, led to the development of a very strict hierarchical, what one could argue, caste system in a way, with black slaves and Native Americans being on the bottom with no rights whatsoever, and then mestizos, mix Spanish and Native American individuals, and mulattoes, mix African and Spanish individuals, having being the lowest of the quote unquote middle class, with both not receiving any kind of inheritance, and then you had the Creoles, who are part of the upper class. Essentially, they were both their parents were born in Spain, but this person was born in Mexico, and they could inherit land and still be considered part of the upper class. And then you had the Peninsulars, who were born in Spain, and then would migrate to Mexico and essentially could do anything. And here's a picture of the sort of harsh treatments that the Native Americans suffered under the encomienda system. And here's a picture of the several Native Americans being captured in the Caribbean for the encomienda system. But it still shows generally sort of how this would have happened. And again, here's a image of several Native Americans being forced to march towards these encomiendas. And then this is a picture of a Native American in Mexico being severely beaten in the encomienda system. So now with that, we need to look at what eventually led to the revolt, which, I mean, you can already imagine what some of the issues that eventually led to a revolt are. But let's take a look at this little prelude. So, first of all, in the 1670s, drought began to sweep through the Southwest, um, destroying crops, and of course, meaning there was very little water in the Southwest, period. And then, also around this time, uh, an individual by the name of Popey and 46 other medicine men are arrested and accused of sorcery by Juan Francisco Trevino before being freed when 70 Pueblo warriors showed up at the governor's office and demanded, quote, politely but persistently, that Popey and the others be released. And this happened in 1675 CE. So after his imprisonment, Popey would retire to Taos Pueblo, where he would eventually claim that he was visited by a triumvirate of spirits who were able to shoot fire from their fingertips. And these three individuals told him that the crops would return. That the rain would return, the crops would grow again, and the Pueblo would have a better future, but only after the Spanish and their Christian God were completely driven from Pueblo lands. And then after receiving this vision, or Popey began to plan for rebellion. Now, one could argue that this story was come up with as a way to inspire the Puebloans into revolt, but Popey was a medicine man, so it is very likely he just had a vision quest of some sort. And I know that's a little bit of a loaded term for any Native American viewers who are watching, but it's very probable that that's sort of what happened. Is he, using traditional Native American spiritual methods, turned to the spirit world for advice on how to deal with Spanish colonization. And so, after receiving this vision and beginning to plan the rebellion, Popey would, over the course of 5 years, eventually gain the support of all of the northern Pueblos, as well as the Zuni and Hopi, as well as some Apache communities. Though it's important to note that the four southern towns near Santa Fe and the Piro Pueblos near present-day Sorojo did not join in the rebellion, as they were more thoroughly assimilated than the other communities. So Popey just did not even approach them, as he could not risk combining in the two concerns about their allegiance. And this rebellion that Popey was building over the course of this 5 years was built around a singular, clear objective: drive the Spanish from their ancestral land, eradicate their influence, and return to the traditional ways of life. And so once he gathered these towns and then other communities outside of the Pueblo world, such as the Zuni, Hopi, and Apache, Pope set the date for the uprising for August 11th, 1680 CE. And he would dispatch runners to all of the Pueblo communities, carrying knotted cords with the instruction for the Pueblo leaders to untie one knot from the cord each morning. And when the last knot was untied, that would be the day for them to rise against the Spanish in unison. And he, of course, told each pueblo to raise its mission church, kill the resident priest and Spanish settlers. Um, and the pueblos did plan on destroying the outlying Spanish settlements and then eventually converging onto the capital to kill or expel the remaining Spanish. Unfortunately for Pope and his alliance, the southern Tiwa leaders did find out about the revolt and warned the Spanish about the said revolt. And after this, the Spanish intercepted two of the runners on August 9th, where they proceeded to torture them until they revealed the significance of this knotted cord. However, when Pope and the leaders realized that their plan had been compromised, they just simply decided to start the revolt early. They dispatched runners with new instructions, though it's also important to note that Acoma, the town of Acoma, and the Zuni and Hopi didn't get the message in time due to the vast distance between Taos and the western pueblos. So they adhered to the original timeline. But with this, the Pueblo Revolt would begin in 1680 CE, specifically August 10th, 1680 CE. So, with the revolt now in full swing, the Puebloans would rise up and would steal the Spaniards' horses to prevent them from fleeing. They would then seal off the roads to Santa Fe, and they began to pillage Spanish settlements, all during August 10th of 1680 CE. So with that, now let's take a look at what both sides would have used in terms of weapons and how their warriors and soldiers would have looked. So the indigenous warriors of the Southwest would have, at the onset of the Pueblo Revolt, would have generally looked something like this. And this, having wooden shields, as well as types of armor that were like, say, padded armor or even wooden armor. And of course, there's some variation to this, but this is very similar to how they would have looked. And the weapons that they would have used included things such as the wooden shield that I mentioned, unsurprisingly, bows and arrows. Many Pueblo warriors would have used slings to hurl stones at people with great force. And then there would be a variety of war clubs that would look very similar to these, whether they had buffalo or horse jaws, or would just be a more typical war club. Now, it is important to note, while I'm using these two pictures here, these are Puebloan war clubs from a little bit later, from around the 1700s and 1800s. So there may be some difference in design in terms of how they would have looked during the Pueblo Revolt. But other than that, the way they were used and the way that the weapons themselves were designed would have been very similar to what the Puebloan peoples would have used during the Pueblo Revolt. They also, of course, used spears, and many of them began to take up European weapons during this revolt, such as the Spanish sword here. Which leads us to the Spanish. What did the Spanish soldiers and their weapons look like at the onset of the Pueblo Revolt? Well, for one thing, this is generally what the Spanish musketeers would have looked like. And this is sort of what a Spanish dragoon or cavalryman would look like, and that is a Spanish pikeman. Now you might be asking, why a pikeman? Well, that's because, well, and here's the Spanish cavalry here, but the reason pikemen were so prominent is because the main Spanish battle formation during this period of time was known as a tercio. So, in the center of this formation, there would be a square of pikemen, and then on each corner, there would be musketeers to fire at, and off at each side. And the Spanish used weapons that are probably very unsurprising to a lot of people. Of course, the Spanish sword that I mentioned, and they used muskets, and then pikes, as well as pistols. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the course of this rebellion. So, as the Puebloans were stealing Spanish horses and sealing off roads to Santa Fe and raiding Spanish settlements, the Pueblo eventually killed a total of 400 people, including men, women, and children, and 21 of the 33 Franciscan missionaries in New Mexico. In the rebellion at Tusayan, Hopi churches at Awatovi. I'm probably going to butcher these, so I apologize. Awatovi, Shungo, Shungopavi, and Oriabi. All of the churches would be destroyed, and the attending priests would be killed, as you see here. After that, the survivors would flee to Santa Fe, where eventually the Puebloans would surround the city and cut off its water supply. In desperation, on August 21st, New Mexico Governor Antonio de Ultramin, barricaded in the palace of the governors at the time, would sally outside of the palace with all of his available men and would eventually force the Puebloans to retreat with heavy losses. He would then lead the Spaniards out of the city and retreat southward along the Rio Grande, heading for specifically El Paso del Norte. Though the Puebloans would shadow the Spaniards the entire way, but also the Puebloans would not attack them during this point in time, as they simply wanted to make sure that they were actually leaving. And this would officially end the Pueblo Revolt in August 21st of 1680 CE, which would lead to 12 years of peace lasting from 1680 to 1692 CE. So, but as this peace began to ramp up, it's important to point out that Popey himself would begin to become increasingly tyrannical and puritanical in his methods and views. So he would eventually be deposed sometime between March and November of 1681 CE, and would be replaced for one of his main lieutenants, Luis Tupatu. Also, Antonio de Ultramin would attempt to retake New Mexico in November, shortly after Popey had been deposed, only to be driven out of the region yet again. So, with that, despite the setbacks of Popey being deposed and of Ultramin's failed attempt to retake New Mexico, this was a time period of relative peace that led to the Puebloan reoccupation and rebuilding of ancestral dwellings after this successful rebellion. And here is a map here showing all of the vistas that existed before and after 1680. With many of the most studied by archaeologists, areas in pueblos being areas like Patokwa, um, uh, as well as Bullet Squaw. And as you can see, when they began to reoccupy these areas, they began to reorient these cities to their ancestral beliefs, as seen in this, specifically in this outline here, where you can see things like home of the spider grandmother, home of the butterfly, etc., 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 with the gateways point to these areas and establish relations with the powers believed to dwell there. You would also see a resurgence in ancestral practices as well as cultural hybridity. So you might be asking, Dane, what is cultural hybridity? Well, cultural hybridity, as seen in this list of various definitions related to culture, the mixing of culture, hybridity stresses ambivalence, mockery, resistance, and agency. It emphasizes disjuncture and forcing together of unlike beings, with evidence of resistance and subversion and ambivalence on the part of the Pueblo toward the Spanish. So, as we can see, they begin to reuse and reestablish cultural practices as seen by these traditional Pueblo religious figures carved into the wall. But there was also a lot of evidence of this hybridity that we just talked about, specifically seen in this figure, known as the Virgin Kachina. And this is also the figure here. So the Virgin Kachina is thought to be a hybridization of the Virgin Mary with a traditional Puebloan Kachina religious spiritual figure, as seen here. And so what this means is that essentially they were taking and co-opting the Virgin Mary to a certain degree into their religion, and just essentially taking the power away from the Virgin Mary and by proxy the Christian God, and making her not connected to Christianity, but making her just yet another Kachina or Puebloan spirit or deity or what have you. The Puebloans also began to take control of the churches, that many churches that they had not destroyed, where they would still destroy many of the religious figures, but then they would begin to use the churches as these religious kivas that had been outlawed during Spanish rule. And so, as you can see here, the reason they use this is because the lack of windows and a single continuous central space can be seen. Dim lighting and singular space were characteristics and themes of kivas, reflecting the cultural hybridity of that could be brought into colonial mission churches. So again, here or the Pueblos were seizing control of what had been the weapon used to subjugate them and enslave them, and using it for their own spiritual uses rather than for the uses of Christianity and the uses of the Spanish Empire. We also see that very similarly in the use of candle holders by Puebloans and other Southwest Native American cultures, such as the Zuni, you can see here. We also begin to see new ceramic traditions. So, ceramic traditions before and during Spanish rule looked something like these. This one is actually from right up until until the Pueblo Revolt, during Spanish rule from 1629 to 1680. But most of the pottery that you can see here is from around 1100 or 1300, etc. But what we begin to see is that after the revolt, pottery designs begin to change. So as you can see in this graph, Yemez black and white pottery, as seen here, was made in large numbers in the pre-revolt, but began to steadily decline post-revolt, whereas historic redware and trade wares were made in much smaller numbers pre-revolt and were made in much larger numbers post-revolt. And that's where we'll begin to see new designs begin to show up on Puebloan pottery. We begin to see step sort of designs, like stair designs, if you could call it that. You begin to see the use of mountain-shaped designs, as well as these stepped designs that you see here of a different variety from these. You also begin to see these sort of inverted hook designs here, as well as feather designs right here. And this is all these pottery designs would continue to be used well into the modern day in what is known as the Pueblo 5 period for pottery. We also begin to see increasing trade with outside indigenous cultures, such as the Navajo, or more properly known as the Diné, as described in this paper by Lori and Paul Reed, titled The Protohistoric Navajo Implications of Interaction, Exchange, and Alliance Formation with the Eastern and Western Pueblos. And here's a map showing the distributions of the Navajo sites in the study area. Now, I'm not going to go over each of these graphs, so you can pause to read them, but what the archaeological evidence shows is that after the Pueblo Revolt and the reestablishment of Pueblo rule over much of the American Southwest, Puebloan pottery types from the Eastern and Western Pueblos, ceramic types, begin to show up in large numbers in Navajo sites, as well as other things such as obsidian and other trade goods. So this suggests that there was a large amount of trade going on and cultural exchange going on between the Pueblo and the Navajo during this 12 years period of peace. Here's another graph showing more of that here. The Spanish would also, during this point in time, begin to attempt to retake Mexico yet again, launching two different expeditions in 1687 and 1689, only to be pushed out of New Mexico each time. But there was also a catch, as many of the leaders who had led the first Pueblo revolts began to die of either old age or disease, as well as many still living Pueblo leaders began to become increasingly factional with each other, i.e. there was a lot of internal strife, and so this would lead to the Pueblo alliance to begin to weaken due to this factionalism. Not only that, it was also during this time that nomadic peoples such as the Utes or the Nuichiu, and again, apologies for possibly butchering that, and the Apache or the Inde, again, apologies for possibly butchering that, during this time, these peoples would begin to heavily raid the Pueblo communities, as you can see here in this map, and they begin to raid them from essentially all directions. And this would include people that they traded with, such as the Navajo or the Diné. So that leads us to the Spanish reconquest of New Mexico. So, capitalizing on the internal strife of the Pueblo Alliance, um, the a Spanish commander by the name of Diego de Vargas would gather 60 Spanish soldiers as well as 100 indigenous auxiliaries or native soldiers who fought for the Spanish crown, and 7 cannons, which it would later use to leverage against the Pueblo inside Santa Fe, and one Franciscan priest, and then he would proceed to march into New Mexico in August of 1692 CE. And as he was leading this expedition, de Vargas would slowly but surely begin to retake all of the Pueblo villages in New Mexico, though many battles are incredibly hard fought for both sides and resulted in high Spanish casualties. One such example is the Battle of Astialaqua. Apologies for butchering that. Where Diego de Vargas would lay siege to the Pueblo for several days and would only be able to take the town thanks to his indigenous auxiliaries. And during the siege, he and his men, as you can see, this is a very steep mesa with very steep cliffs and slopes. As he was laying siege to this, he and his men were incredibly vulnerable to the various types of missiles, arrows, and stones thrown by slings and such that would be used by the Puebloan defenders. So, I mean, imagine trying to charge up this slope, to find the one, especially this side, to try to find a way into the Pueblo while being pelted with every stone you can imagine and being fired at by every arrow you can imagine as well, and maybe even some Spanish guns that would have been co-opted by the Pueblo as well. But eventually, thanks to his indigenous auxiliaries, de Vargas would be able to charge into Astialaqua and take it. Though 81 Puebloans would be able to escape siege, many more, specifically 360 native women and children, were taken prisoner, with 7 of the remaining Puebloans defiantly leaping to their deaths off the cliff rather than facing Spanish subjugation. And with that, the siege of Astialaqua would end the would conclude the Spanish reconquest of New Mexico in July 24th of 1694 CE. And here is a picture of the town, fort, Pueblo and city of Astialaqua. And here's a picture of the stones on the mesa that were made or collected during the siege to provide warriors with the missiles that they would hurl at the Spanish. As you can see, there was a lot, and then one can imagine there was probably a whole lot more during the height of the siege. So now it is time to look at the aftermath of the Pueblo Revolt and the eventual long and bloody reconquest of New Mexico. Well, for one thing, as de Vargas reestablished his Spanish rule over the Spanish colony of New Mexico, specifically the colony of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico would remain a colony of Spain until the 1820s CE. Though this would not be without at least one more attempt at a large-scale rebellion, as the residents of 14 pueblos would attempt to organize a second revolt, and would launch it with the murders of 5 missionaries and 34 settlers, using weapons the Spanish themselves had traded to the natives over the years. Though de Vargas would be quick to put down this revolt, and his retribution would be unmerciful, thorough, and prolonged. and this happened in 1696 CE. Here is a picture of what the killing of those missionaries would have looked like again. And here's a picture of the brutal punishments that de Vargas probably used, or at least one of the brutal punishments. There was probably a variety that de Vargas used against the Puebloan peoples. Now, with that, it's time to look at our last section. Where are the Native American peoples mentioned in this video today? Well, the Puebloans still exist. They still exist as a culture uh, and live in several different communities in New Mexico, as you can see here on this map. And as you can see, their culture is still alive and well, but not without further attempts at the eradication of their culture by the U.S. as well as Mexico. And then the Hopi are also still around today, residing mainly in Arizona, with them having their own nation for their having their own specific nation, the Hopi Nation that you can see here. And then the Zuni are much the same way. The Zuni have their own nation and their reservation that they were much like the Hopi were forced onto by the United States. And like both the Hopi and the Puebloans, their culture is still alive and well. And then the Navajo. The Navajo, again, like all of these groups, are still extant, despite the best horrible attempts of colonial powers like Spain and the United States. And they reside on the largest reservation, the Navajo Nation that you see here. And again, their cultural practices are still alive and well. And with that, that ends our video. I hope you enjoyed this video about America's first American Revolution, about the first American Revolution of North America. If you want to see me cover any of the subjects mentioned in this video in greater detail, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe.